Welcome back to the FM shop. I'm Mike, and this is part 3 of the Stage 1 Turbo Kit installation series. And in this episode, we're going to be covering all of the oil pan modifications and other oil line prep that you need to do to be able to install a turbo on your car. This is the part that most people dread when they come to putting a turbo on their NA or NB Miata. We're talking about drilling the oil pan. Now, it doesn't have to really be scary or be dangerous or any of that. It's actually a pretty straightforward thing to do. So let's talk about it. What are the first things we need to do? Well, we need to mark out the oil pan. So on this one, we got an engine out of the car just to show you a little bit better what kind of positioning and marking that we're talking about. So on this oil pan, what we're doing is we want to take basically a measurement from the bottom where the flange of the oil pan meets the engine block. And you can see I've got a mark drawn here. This mark is right at 2 inches. So I just drew a line, and what we're looking to do is we're looking to get the right measurement as far as distance. We want it to be lower down, but we don't want it to be any lower than about 2 inches. If you need to do it a little bit higher for a touch more clearance, that's okay, but really this is about the line that we're aiming for. Now, also, you want to position your hole where you're going to drill the hole is about as far forward on the oil pan as you can get, reasonably speaking. Now, I usually try to stay just in front of this little relief right here that's here for this bolt on the oil pan. And remember that the hole that we're going to be drilling is just a hair over and a half inch in diameter. So I would go from about here on this little detent, move in a roughly 1/4 of an inch, mark that spot with a center punch, and then use a pilot drill and drill it out. Now I'm going to mark the hole, or at least I'm going to center punch where we're going to start drilling the hole. So this is where I'm going to take, starting from about here, the edge of that detent, I'm going to measure about 1/4 of an inch in or so. So this is where I'm looking about here. So I'm going to have a little bit of room on this side, a little bit of room all the way around, because our hole, again, is going to be just over a half an inch. I'm just going to center punch it right here, just to have a little mark. So now I know that this little mark right here is the center of our oil drain hole. Now when I drill this, I don't want to start with the big drill bit that's included. That's a 37/64 drill bit. I'm actually going to start with something a little bit smaller. So this is about 1/4 an inch, maybe 3/16 drill bit. You can see on this one that I've actually wrapped some tape around it. And the reason being is that when I drill through that oil pan, I don't want to go too far in. The thickness of the oil pan is maybe about 1/4 of an inch, a little under 1/4 of an inch. So that's what I've done, is taken some tape and I've wrapped it about 1/4 of an inch down from the top of the drill bit. Now this way I can get it lined up with that punch mark and I can drill it through. And once I have the pilot hole drilled, then I will switch to the 37/64. And same thing, I've taken some electrical tape and I put it about 1/4 of an inch down. And this just prevents me from pushing that drill bit all the way through into the pan. And you don't want to do that because your oil pickup tube is right behind this. So if you plunge your drill bit too far into the oil pan, you can hit that pickup tube, and if you put a hole in it, then there goes your oil pressure. Bye-bye engine. So this is very important to either use some electrical tape and just do a few wraps around it. You can also take a length of rubber hose and cut it to where that rubber hose is basically all the way down the drill bit, but exposes just the top 1/4 inch. Either way, you're just trying to give yourself a stop to where when you drill through, it won't push all the way through, because you'll have to apply pressure to that drill bit to help it actually drill through the oil pan. Before you drill your oil pan for the oil drain line off the turbo, if you have access to compressed air in your shop or garage, this is a good way to help prevent any of those aluminum chips or shavings from falling into the oil pan. This is an optional step, so if you don't, that's okay. There's ways around it, but this is a good way to do it if you do have access to these tools. So here you can see we've got an air hose hooked up. This is actually just run to the breather here off of the valve cover for the PCV system. I just have a 3/8 hose attached to a simple air tool that I have zip tied shut. This looks a little bit rigged because it is. I wanted to show that this can be done with fairly common tools that you have in your own garage if you have access to normal air compressor tools. But all this is just a hose, the air tool, the handle zip tied. Got a hose running over here to a regulator. So this is just a simple pressure regulator. I have compressed air from our compressor coming in, and then I can hook it up on this end to our fitting. And I've got it regulated right now to about 5 psi. Now of course you'll need a regulator that goes down a bit about this low, because if you have it turned up too high, you may actually blow out some of the oil seals on your engine. So we recommend at first, before you have the hole drilled, only turn it up to about 5 psi. So now that we have the air connected, we have some air being pumped into the crankcase, and now you can actually feel, if you put your finger over the dipstick tube, you have some pressure. If you leave it like that and take it off, you can actually hear a kind of a spout. So what we're going to do to be able to keep this pressure in here and keep it from escaping out the oil dipstick tube is simply put your dipstick back in. This is just temporary, so that way we can hold a little bit of pressure in the crankcase. So 5 psi shouldn't be enough to blow this dipstick tube out. If you have a really worn out O-ring, it may still pop out, and at which point you may need to get creative on how to cap off your dipstick tube. But this should be good to go. Now we can go down and drill the oil pan, and that pressure will help to push some of the shavings back out instead of letting them fall in. Now you can see on this car, this is a NB2. It's a 2002 Miata that has AC and power steering. This is kind of a worst case scenario for all of the hoses and lines that you're going to have in the engine bay. Cars that don't have AC and or power steering will have less going on down here, and the NAs generally will have a bit more room down here too, compared to some of the NBs like this one. So in order to give yourself a bit more room, if you need to, you can unbolt some of those lines just to give yourself a little bit of a leg up on reaching the oil pan and drilling for that oil drain line. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take off a couple of bolts and nuts for this power steering line, just to be able to give me a little bit of play with this whole assembly, give me a better shot at reaching that oil pan. Removing these pieces of hardware here won't allow me to move the entire line, because there still are some hard attachment points like this banjo here on the steering rack itself. But after taking these pieces of hardware off, it does give me a little bit of freedom to wiggle it around just a little bit. So this is all I'm looking for, just to give me a little bit of extra room. These AC lines, of course, you can't do a whole bunch with them because they have hard mounting points so close, but you can flex the hoses up and out of the way a little bit to be able to get back there to the pan a little bit easier. So if you have manual steering, car without AC, this will be much easier for you. In preparation of drilling the oil pan on this particular Miata, I have gone ahead and moved the air conditioning pump. So I didn't actually remove it, I didn't undo any of the lines, but as you can see here, I've unbolted the 4 bolts that attach the pump to the bracket, and I've simply pushed it up out of the way with some bungees, just to give me a fighting chance at getting a straighter shot to the oil pan. This may not be necessary in everyone's circumstance. This is kind of a bit more convoluted down here because of the NB2 setup, but if you need to get a straighter shot at the oil pan when you drill your hole, then you can simply unbolt it and shove it up out of the way. You on NBs, you will need to take off the belts anyway to be able to get access to the pulley, since we'll be changing out the timing wheel. So not a bad time to do this if you need to do it. Like I said, not always required, but this will make it a little bit easier to get to the oil pan. We are now ready to do the scary part. we are going to drill the oil pan. Before that though, we've already marked it. Now I'm going to use a center punch to give myself a fighting chance of staying on my mark here for when I start using the drill bits. So I'm simply going to put my center punch right in the middle of my mark, make myself a little divot. Now what I'm going to do is use a drill. This is a small drill, it's about a 1/4 inch or so. You can see that I've actually added a little bit of electrical tape to it. I've left about a 1/4 inch exposed, but then I've added this electrical tape so that way when I drill through the pan, the tape will stop the bit from going any deeper, because we don't want to hit the oil pickup tube that's just on the other side of the wall of the oil pan. So what we're going to do here is also hedge our bets just a little bit by applying some grease. So what this grease will do is it's going to catch some of the shavings that is coming out of the oil pan. You don't need to really goop it up, just a little bit like that to fill the flutes. And then last step that we're going to do before I actually start putting holes in this oil pan is turn on the air. Now this is an optional step, but as I explained earlier, we have compressed air. So I'm going to hook it up. Now this is applying about 5 psi to the entire crankcase to help blow out some of the chips when that happens. Now I'm going to drill using the smaller pilot drill bit basically to make my first hole. And when I push through, it finally just breaks the inner surface of the oil pan. I'm going to stop and then increase my air pressure up to 10 psi. And of course, don't forget, safety first. There are going to be shavings potentially flying out of the oil pan, especially if this is one that you've got some pressure on it. So make sure to wear your goggles. All right, so I just popped through. You can see the tape caught me from going any further. So now that we have that compressed air coming out of the oil pan, I'm going to turn the pressure up to 10 psi. And the reason we're turning it up a little bit is that now that this hole is here, obviously I'm not going to plug it, but most all of the pressure that's coming through, we're just trying to improve some of that airflow coming out of this hole to help push those chips and flakes out. 5 psi would probably be okay. We don't want to turn it up past 10 psi because at that point this may still be enough of a restriction to blow out seals. Now that the pilot hole has been drilled, it's time to step up to the large bit. So this is the 37/64 drill bit that's included in the tool kit, if you did accept to get this along with your Stage 1 turbo kit package. So I've done the same thing, added a little bit of electrical tape here. I gave it 3, 4, 5 wraps of tape, that's all you need. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this one and fill up the flutes with a little bit of grease. This is just chassis grease. It really doesn't matter what you use. Just something to help catch the chips. There you go. Okay, and now we're going to drill with this larger bit through the oil pan. Don't forget, safety squints on. And I've got a fairly straight shot at this. If you don't have quite an absolutely 90-degree perpendicular shot, it's okay. If you're at a huge angle like this, you need to figure something else out. But as long as you're pretty close, that's all we're looking for here. So here we go, we're going to drill to the large size for the bung that'll go in there. All right, there we go. And as you saw, most of the chips came flying back out towards us instead of falling into the oil pan. And then quite a bit of them here ended up getting caught on the drill bit too, hence the reason for greasing it up. So now we'll clean up this hole a little bit and we'll throw a tap through it to give it some threads. Finally, the scary part is over. We don't have to worry about hitting that oil pickup tube. We got our hole drilled in our oil pan. So now what's left is just to tap it. Also included with that big drill bit in the tool bag is going to be one of these. This is a 3/8 by 18 thread pitch NPT tap. So this guy is what we're going to use to put threads in our oil pan to be able to thread in a hose barb. So depending on which kit you have, if you've got the soft lines, you'll get the slightly larger hose barb. It's a 5/8 hose barb. Or if you've got the hard lines, it's a 1/2 inch. So the threads on the back that are going to thread it into the pan are the same. So it's the same tap for either kit. Now we're going to use the same trick on this tap as we did for the drill bits. We're going to put a little bit of grease here in the flutes and also in the threads, just to help catch shavings. This doesn't need to be chock full of grease, but you do want to put a little bit in there so that way it's got a good chance at catching anything. There you go. Just like that. There is a proper tool for holding these guys on this square driver side. I'm going to guess that most people probably don't own it because it's kind of a large one, and the most appropriate one I found to use, that most everybody's going to have, is a 15mm 12-point socket. So the square fits right in there. It's a nice tight fit, and I'm going to use a ratcheting solid head ratchet, so that way whenever I'm twisting this tap through the hole, then hopefully I can keep it as square to the pan as possible. I would recommend against using any kind of swiveling head ratchet, but this will give us the best chance of making sure that our threads are nice and perpendicular to the edge of the pan. I've also got the compressed air again running about 10 psi, so that way there's a little bit of a breeze coming through, and this will hopefully push out some of the shavings, if there are any, that may otherwise fall into the oil pan. So what I'm going to do first though is put on my safety goggles and then fit in this tap. So you can see right here, I can hold it with my finger out of the way, it's going to be pretty tight up against this bracket for the AC pump. This may be another good argument for you that if you need a little bit more space, unbolt that AC pump, push it up out of the way. Not absolutely required, but it may help you out. So get it lined up here. That's all we're looking at. Just make sure we have enough room. And then get it lined up with your hole and start applying a little bit of pressure from the back side, so that way you can get it to start taking a bite and start twisting. As you're doing this, it's going to want to walk around a little bit. Do your best to try to keep this as perpendicular to the oil pan as possible. This is when getting it as close to perpendicular as possible is going to really pay off. You don't want to have too much angle, because if you create a dip in your oil drain line, then you can get pooling of the oil, and that can lead to a smoking turbo. Alright, so now it's finally taken a bite into the oil pan. So I'm able to just keep everything in line. Everything looks good. Looks perpendicular to that surface of the oil pan. So I'm just going to keep on tapping this, run it in a little ways. This is pretty thin-walled aluminum oil pan, so if you feel it starting to bind up here, you can reverse it a little bit, back it off just a touch, and then go back to tightening it or tapping new threads. But since it's so thin, you may not need to do that. Okay, so I've got about halfway down the tap now. And I'm going to back it out because I want to check that hose barb again. All right, there we go. Caught lots of chips again, that's good. Carefully wipe up the excess around the edge here. Try not to push it in. So now I'm going to try the threads, just see how deep into that fitting it gets threaded down by hand. Ooh, that's looking pretty good. All right, so that's about what you want to see. I've got almost halfway threaded in here with this barb into the oil pan. So now that this is at a good, the tap is at a good point as far as the depth is concerned for this fitting, we're good to go ahead and clean up the threads. We'll pour a little bit of mineral spirits into the pan to help flush out any potential chips that might have accidentally fallen in. And then we'll apply some thread paste to this fitting and then tighten up for good. With the scary part well and truly dusted, we've got the oil pan drilled and tapped. Now the only thing we have left to do is clean it up. So there may still be a few shavings that have fallen in the hole into the oil pan right here, and we just want to ensure that we get everything cleaned up and that there aren't any shavings that might wind up trying to get into your engine oil as far as up into any of the passages. So in order to clean everything up and ensure that that doesn't happen, the last step we're going to do is take some mineral spirits and pour it in here. Now you're probably asking yourself, how the heck are you going to do that? Well, first thing before we get to that point, what you want to do is set up a drain pan. So all this fluid that's going to be coming in through here, of course, is going to come out the drain hole. So I've set up a pan. We're going to take the oil drain plug back out. And see, there's a little bit residual in oil in here that's built up over the past few hours that we've been doing this. But that's all right. But now that we have the oil drain plug off and that oil is draining, what we're going to do to get some mineral spirits poured in through here is actually take our oil drain line. And I've already taken the hose fitting and stuck it into that hose. So what we're going to do is simply feed this through. You can do it if you want from the engine bay side if you really want to be able to get a nice angle on it. I like to do it here through the wheel well. But just feed it through to where you can get it onto the threaded hole that you've just made. Thread it in, oh, maybe a turn or two. We just want to get it to where that thread is just inside. We don't want to have it to where the threaded portion is way inside, because we want to make sure to try to wash off some of the wall here, that if there's any shavings or chips that are stuck on the inside of the hole right underneath it. But here I've got the hose just up into the wheel well, and here I've got enough run that I can then attach a very narrow spout style filler neck. This is just going to be something most people can pick up at an auto parts store, but this will fit into our hose quite easily like this, and then I can then pour some mineral spirits in through here. Now this process is much the same for if you have a hardline kit versus a softline oil drain kit. The only difference is that with the hardline, it's not quite as easy to be able to route it like this to be able to dump in some mineral spirits. So what you can do is, of course, you're threading in the slightly smaller hose barb into the oil pan instead, and then use a length of 1/2-inch hose. You can use whatever, but as long as you're using some kind of 1/2-inch hose, and that 1/2-inch hose still allows you to insert the neck of your filler spout, that's all you're looking for. So you may need to do a hardware run and go to the auto parts store if you don't have just a length of hose, but you can be creative here too. Whatever is easier for you to get this mineral spirits into the oil pan, that's fine. I've also talked to customers that have used a pump, like a fluid transfer pump, to be able to pump some mineral spirits into their oil pan. So whatever works best that you have handy, that's fine. That's probably the best route anyway. So let's go ahead and pour in some mineral spirits. I'm using regular mineral spirits, nothing special here. This is a solvent, so it will help wash away those chips. It also will help wash away any residual oil that they may be sticking to, which is good. Because it is a solvent, it is something that will dry. Just if you leave it out long enough, exposed to air, it will dry up. So once we get done pouring this and we let it drain for a little while, you want to give it at least 15 minutes to allow all of this mineral spirits to either drain out the oil pan or to evaporate. Now, this goes without saying, don't use this in an enclosed place. If you have your car in a small garage, you may want to open up the door, some windows, or get a fan going. You don't want to breathe the fumes of this, so make sure that you're safe when you're using mineral spirits. I'm just going to dump a little bit at a time. Don't need to go crazy. Just feed it down there. This also helps to prevent huge flows of the mineral spirits going down there and just totally washing through out that spigot and basically not running down the wall. So we want a slow flow going down this tube if you can. There we go. So after a few rinses like this, go ahead and pull your hose and your filler out here. Let it dry, let it flush for 15 minutes or so. And then after that, we'll go ahead and put the oil drain pan adapter hose barb in for good. We've got all the shavings and swarth washed out of the oil pan now, and I have let this drain. It's just dripping any excess down now. We'll put the oil pan plug back in here after that's finished up. And while we're waiting for that, we can go ahead and put in our hose barb that's going to go into our oil pan. So of course we're going to use some thread paste on the threads. Optionally, if you want to make this extra permanent, you can mix up some JB Weld and do that instead. If you want to give yourself options down the road, I would recommend just using thread paste. Either is fine, it's up to you. We're just looking to add a little bit of insurance to seal these threads. So as always, we're going to add just a little bit here on the threads. Leaving the first two threads uncoated, since they won't be doing much work anyway. We don't want to let too much of this thread paste inside the pan to wash off in the oil, so leave those ones uncoated. And now we thread this into our oil pan. Okay, so it's threaded in my hand. Now we need to tighten it down. Remember, NPT fittings, this is going to be snug. It's roughly going to be 1.5 to 3 times or rotations after you get it hand tight. So you can use a 11/16 wrench to be able to snug this up. You can also use a socket if you have enough room. You may need to use a couple different methods just depending on what your access is. Okay, now that that is snugged up, you can wipe off any of that excess if you like, or you can leave it, doesn't make any difference. Now it's time to put together the oil feed line to be able to feed the turbocharger. So to do that, we need to actually tap into the engine oil off of the engine block itself. Now to do that, we've included a few parts with the Stage 1 turbo kits. For the 1996 through 2005, you'll have a brass T. You'll also have a fitting like this that has 2 threaded male ends. And then you'll have this guy that comes with these neat little caps that has an adapter, one of them going to a -4, so that way you can tie into the stainless steel braided line that we include. Now to look at these guys a little bit closer, this little brass T is 1/8 NPT on all 3 sides. This little adapter here, one side, you can see this side is just a little bit more tapered. It also has a flat end. This is the 1/8 BSPT that will be threaded into the engine block. And then on the other side, just a little bit thicker, and it also has a bevel on this end. So this side is the 1/8 NPT. So this end will get threaded into the brass T. And this last piece, this is 1/8 NPT on this side, and this will get threaded into the brass T. And then this side, again, is the dash 4 AN fitting, and this will be able to attach that stainless steel braided line that will feed the turbocharger. So to put these pieces together, first what we'll do is we'll mount this brass tee in a vise. Good and snug like that. So one piece here on this side, we'll say this is the side that's threading into the engine block. So this is where we'll need the fitting that looks very same on both ends. Now remember, the side that's NPT that'll thread into here is the side with the bevel. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply a little bit of thread paste to it before we thread into this brass tee. Now these are tapered fittings, so theoretically when you thread them in, they should seal by themselves. But to give us just a little bit more insurance, we're just going to add a little bit of thread sealant on this. Now you don't need a whole bunch. Really, you only need a little dab, just like that. And then I'm going to smear it all the way around. And then you can see how most of that is smeared about 2 or 3 threads up from the very tip. That's because when I thread in this fitting, those first couple of threads aren't going to be contacting the brass tee very much on the inside. So most of the sealing action is going to come a few threads in as it tapers and then bottoms out against the threads on the brass tee. So we'll go ahead and thread this in here. This one is a 7/16 size hex, and we're just going to thread this in here. Now this is tapered, of course, so it's not going to ever bottom out, but we're just looking to make this thread snug. So don't go crazy, just good and snug is all you need. Okay, so now any excess of that thread paste will just kind of build up on the outside since we've been tightening it in. If you want to, just take a rag, clean it up. You can leave it if you'd like. You don't need a whole bunch. So again, that's just a little bit of additional insurance. Now the other side, we'll flip this around. The other side here is where we're going to insert our pressure sender. So this is the oil pressure sending unit that comes off the engine block, and we'll show you where this actually lives here in a few moments. But this thread, once it comes out of the engine block, we're just going to put it on the other side of our brass tee. So same thing here, we're going to apply a little bit of thread paste to those threads before we put it in, just to give us a little bit of insurance. A little dab like that. Smear it on the threads, and then thread it in here. So this one will probably thread in a little bit further down, and once you have it on there, just a little bit hand tight. This is a 24mm hex that's on here, so you can either use a big wrench like this, or if you've got a 24mm socket, that'll work too. And we're just looking to snug this up. Same story, don't need to go crazy, just getting it tight. Okay. All right, so now that we have those two fittings on here like this, that's what you're looking for. Now this last opening on the tee, the foot of the tee, this is where our adapter for the oil feed line will go. We don't want to put this in just yet. We want to be able to thread this into the engine block first, and then after we have it threaded into the block and positioned, then we'll attach this. Otherwise, if you put it in now, you'll hit hoses and wires, and if this is an NB, your knock sensor. So don't thread this in just yet. It'll cause you more problems, and you'll just have to take it back out. So now that we have this put together, let's go over to the engine block and we'll see how it threads in. So here we are on the passenger side of the engine. This one is removed from the engine bay to let you see a little bit better what's going on here. This is a 99 or 2000 year engine, although what we're interested in, this little sensor, is going to look the same for 1996 all the way up to 2005. This is the oil pressure sending unit that's here on the side of the block. This is underneath the intake manifold, just next to the oil filter. Now this is the same little pressure sender that we were seeing earlier when we were assembling that brass T to be able to thread it into the block right here. So let's go ahead, we'll take this guy out. This is a 24mm hex that's on this sensor. I'm just going to use a ratchet with a 24mm socket. It needs to be a deep socket so that way it can fit over the sensor tab. And here it is. Normally you would clean this up and then install it into that brass T, but thanks to the magic of television, we've already done that. So here's our fitting. It's got the fitting that screws into the block, our T, and then that new oil pressure sender. So just like what we did here with the T, we want to apply a little bit of thread paste to this fitting that's threaded into the block. Now this is the BSPT threaded fitting, so no bevel, just flat to the end. That way you know that's the right one to go into the engine block. So I will apply just a little bit. Oh, too much. A little bit of thread paste to this guy. Now that there's some thread paste on this guy, we can go ahead and thread it into the engine block. So same area here. You may need to move some hoses a little bit out of the way to be able to get access to it easily. But just thread it in there like that. And once you get it kind of tight, you can't turn it by hand anymore. You can use a 9/16 wrench. And this will be the right size for the brass T, but you can turn the brass T with the wrench to be able to tighten it up. Okay, once you have your brass T in there snug, again, we're not looking for anything crazy, just nice and snug, you'll have that leg of the T pointing towards the back of the engine. We are going to install this fitting. So this is the 1/8 MPT male going to the -4AN male that'll come into this piece and allow us to fit up the stainless steel braided hose. So since this is NPT, we want to apply a little bit of thread paste and then thread this into the engine, or to the brass T rather. Now the hex on this guy is 1/2. So snug, not over tight. Now that the adapter for the braided stainless steel hose has been threaded into our brass T here, now we need to apply a little bit of oil to the threads before we attach the hose onto the fitting. So just a little bit of like engine oil will do. It doesn't really matter the grade. All we're doing is lubricating the threads and the mating face of this -4AN fitting a little bit to give us enough lubrication to prevent the threads from galling or the mating surface of this bevel from galling against the female side. So just a little bit will do. We're not looking for anything to really goop it up, just a light coating of oil, just like that. And then you'll take your stainless steel hose, thread it on, and then snug it down with a 9/16 wrench. Now the last thing that you'll need to do here is take the end of the hose and feed it up behind the engine to the driver's side. That way you can have it poking out. Of course there's no car here, so we'll show you a little bit later what that's like in the vehicle. But this is just going behind the engine over to the driver's side for now, just to get it up into position and be ready for when the turbo goes on the car. Last thing that you need to do while you're down here, reconnect your wire for your oil pressure sender, and you're done. Installing the oil feed fitting for the 90 through 95 engine blocks, and then also the Mazda Speed if you happen to be using one, is a little bit different than the standard 96 up fittings. So on these engines you actually have an additional port on the driver's side or the exhaust side. This engine we've removed all of the exhaust side fittings so that way you can see everything a little bit easier. But what we're talking about is down here at the very end of the block at the bottom. So you'll see there's a bolt here with a little copper crush washer on it, and this is the passage that we're concerned about. This is an oil passage. So on these engines, this is blocked off. Mazda uses it as an access to be able to machine the oil passages in the block and then simply caps it with a bolt. But we're going to use that as an oil feed for these engine blocks. Now be sure that you're not confusing it with this particular port. This one is actually into the water jacket on the number 4 cylinder. So this actually is for water. Normally you'd have a bolt here very similar to this one. It's a different size, a little bit bigger. This engine block just does not have it for whatever reason. But make sure that you're using this one down here, the lower one that's further back, rather than this one, since we're looking to get oil, not water. This bolt, this is a 14mm head bolt. So simply undo it here. And it'll be a very short bolt, so just a little bitty guy like that. And then we'll simply be replacing it with the new fitting. So this is the adapter that goes from that M10 by 1.5 thread into the -4 for the oil line. So, whoops, remember, before putting this in, it will need a copper crush washer because this isn't a tapered thread, so use the included copper crush washer. Insert it into the engine block and then snug it down. So this particular hex is a 5/8. You will need either a 5/8 wrench or probably a socket will get you better access. Now this guy, again, we're looking for snug. The snug is good enough to just squish that copper crush washer just a little bit to give a good seal. Now next up, we'll be installing our 90-degree fitting. So this is a swivel fitting. That way when we get it on there, we can do kind of a bit of a fine positioning before we tighten it down. But before we do that, these are AN fittings. So you will need to apply a little bit of oil to both the threads and the seating faces, these beveled guys. So doesn't matter particularly what kind of oil you're using, just a little bit of engine oil will do. And you don't need a whole bunch, just a little bit on your finger like that. And just enough to oil up the threads with a light coating. So once you've done that, you can then take the swivel portion, the female side of your fitting, and thread it on the block by hand. So you can see that it's a little bit snug, but I can still move it around just a touch. So you want to get this aimed kind of at a 45-degree forward. And you can fine tune this a little bit later if you find that you want to move it a little bit differently. But have it pointing mostly forward, maybe a touch more forward than up as far as that angle is concerned. And once you're happy with the orientation, you can snug it down. So this little hex is just a bit smaller. It's a 9/16, and you can simply snug it like that. If you want to hold on to that fitting, then you can do so using a 7/16 wrench. We've shown you how to set up the oil feed for the 1990 through 95 engines as well as the 96 through 2000 year engines, but there is a slight variation. The VVT engines from the 2001 to 05 non-Mazda speed engines do have just a little bit different feed. It's the same concept as the 96 through 2000, but it looks a little different. So we have the same adapter, the same brass T, and then the oil pressure sending unit here. And of course, there is no adapter on the leg of the T. Again, this is for ease of installation in the car. But what we're going to do is show you what the difference is here on the engine block. The VVT engines on the 2001 to 05 non-Mazda speed Miatas have an actuator that lives up on the top of the engine. You've got the actuator housing on the valve cover, but that's all fed by oil, and that oil has to come from somewhere. So Mazda is sourcing it from actually the same place that we are sourcing it for the turbo oil feed on all the other years that feed from underside the intake manifold. Now in this one you can still see that pressure sender right there next to the oil filter, and then underneath it there's kind of a odd looking banjo fitting. So the implementation is going to be the same. We're just going to take out that oil pressure sending unit, but instead of threading the new adapter into the engine block, we're actually going to thread it into that strange banjo fitting that you see underneath the oil pressure sending unit. First things first, we need to remove that connector that's attaching the oil pressure sending unit to the rest of the wiring harness. So on this end of it, there's a little button. You'll need to depress that. And once you do, it just comes right off. So I'm just going to stuff this back here behind the starter for now, just to keep it out of the way. Now, this oil pressure sending unit needs to come off. It is a 24 millimeter hex on it, so just use the same socket and wrench technique that we were using on the other engine. And there it is. So now you'll have a little bit of oil that's leaking down here. It might be a good idea to place a rag below it beforehand to catch some of that dripping. But you'll have some residual oil that drips down from the VVT oil feed line. Since it's on top of the engine, you'll get some gravity draining going on. The next step though is to take our adapter that has the brass T and the pressure sensor already threaded into it that we've cleaned up, and thread that right in there. And now I like to wipe up what residual oil might have been dripping out of there, just so that way if you do see any other oil, you can make sure that you get it taken care of or tighten up the fitting a little bit more. Now that the adapter, the brass T, and the oil pressure sender are threaded in there hand tight, you need to go ahead and snug it up with a wrench. You can use a 9/16 wrench on the brass T. You can also use a 7/16 wrench on the adapter that's actually threaded into that banjo section or into the block if this is a 96 through 2000 year. It's the same process here, just without that funny banjo. And we're just looking to snug up that fitting just a little bit more. Okay, so now that we have that fitting snugged, and we also have the orientation of the brass fitting to where the leg of that T is pointing towards the back of the engine, we are ready to put in the adapter. So on this one, I've already gooped it up with some thread paste, so it's good to go. And this just gets threaded into the leg of the brass T. Same story on this adapter. Once you have it threaded in there hand tight, you want to snug it up. You can use a 1/2" wrench. Using a stubby wrench will make your life considerably easier here, just because you have limited space. Looking for snug, not over tight. There we go. Now, as you can tell on this particular application, because of the VVT actuator feed line that's coming down here, this adapter is placed just a little bit lower than it normally would be on a 96 through 2000 year engine. So in this case, instead of having the adapter for the stainless steel braided hose pointed straight back, where right now it's kind of right into the back of the starter, we want to locate that just a little bit further up. We're going to angle it just a touch. This will give us enough clearance to be able to pass that starter and have the hose go up and over the top of it. So right about there is probably good. Next step here is to put a little bit of oil on that male fitting, just to lube the threads and the seating face. Just a light coat, nothing fancy. If it's any easier for you, you can also put just a little bit of oil on the threads and on the mating face of the line. I've already routed this hose behind the engine. You can see that the stainless steel braided hose goes up and over the starter in this particular application and just underneath the intake manifold. and I routed it behind the engine, up and over the transmission, and then onto the driver's side. So this will take a little bit of doing. If you have a second pair of hands that can be reaching around on the back side of the engine from the driver's side, this will help, but this can be done with one person. So the idea here, just get your hose routed correctly and put it in place, and then once that's done, you can get it attached to the male adapter. Now that you have the stainless steel braided hose finger tight onto your oil feed adapter off of the engine block, it's time to snug it up. This is also 9/16 hex, so use a small or stubby wrench to be able to snug that up. There we go. And last but not least, you'll take your wire to the oil pressure sending unit and clip it back into place. And you're done. And that's all for episode 3 regarding the oil feed and preparation. Keep an eye out for episode 4, where we finally cover putting the turbo manifold, turbo, and outlet together. So thanks again for watching. We sure appreciate it. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Also, you can give us a call or send us an email if you want to get in touch with us directly. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.